On Wednesday, May 28, 2026, a family arrived at a funeral home in Washington Heights to say goodbye to their father. They opened the casket, and the man inside was not him. He had hair, he was tall, he was dressed in their father's clothes. But their father was bald and stood 5 feet 3 inches. This was not their father. The funeral home spent hours trying to convince them otherwise. Jose Daniel Diaz Felipe was 84 years old when he died. His family called him Danielito. They had selected R.G. Ortiz Funeral Home in Washington Heights, one of 8 locations the company operates across New York City, and arranged a wake. When they arrived, the casket was closed. When they opened it, they found a stranger. His son, Jose Luis Diaz, put it plainly, "We opened the coffin and find another man, and they were trying for hours to convince us he was our father." Hours. The family held firm. The differences were not subtle, not the kind of thing grief distorts. The man in the casket had hair. He was significantly taller. These were not small details. And yet, the funeral home kept pushing. After the service, they changed their story. There had been a mix-up, they said. 2 people with the same name received the same week, bodies confused, and their father, he had been cremated days before the viewing, before the family was told, before anyone called. The family refused the ashes the funeral home offered. They could not confirm the remains were actually his. "We don't know where our father is right now," Jose Luis Diaz said. The family's attorney, Philip Rizzuto, was direct. "We believe that they knew they made a mistake and were hoping they would be convincing enough to cover it up." He added, "I think what makes it worse is the fact that they cremated him a week before." That is the architecture of this situation. Once Danielito was cremated, without the family's knowledge, without consent, 5 days before his scheduled wake, whatever came next could never be undone. There was no body to return to, no viewing to reschedule. The funeral home's only move was to put someone else in the casket and hope no one noticed. They noticed. The family is now seeking $16 million in damages. The lawsuit describes severe mental, psychological, and traumatic injuries. It uses the word cruel. That is not legal language. That is the family's word. Now, here is what makes this case more than a single failure. R.G. Ortiz Funeral Homes has been here before. Not at this specific breaking point, but close. Close enough that what happened in May 2026 should not have surprised anyone who had been paying attention. Since 2018, 74 consumers had filed complaints against R.G. Ortiz with New York City's Department of Consumer and Worker Protection. 74. The complaints described a consistent pattern: predatory and deceptive practices targeting grieving families. Families were being refused information about where their loved ones' remains were. They were being charged opaque, seemingly random prices for services, often with cash-only payment requirements that made disputes harder to pursue. They were waiting months, sometimes longer, to receive cremated remains or death certificates. And some families said the remains presented to them were in unacceptable conditions. In April 2024, the city finally filed a lawsuit. The Department of Consumer and Worker Protection charged R.G. Ortiz with over 82 violations of the city's consumer protection law. In August 2024, R.G. Ortiz settled. Without admitting wrongdoing, the company agreed to pay more than $700,000, over $600,000 in restitution for harmed consumers, and $100,000 in civil penalties. They also agreed to comply with consumer protection laws going forward, including disclosing the location of remains, providing services that were paid for, and giving families price information up front. That settlement was less than 2 years before Danielito's family opened a casket and found a stranger. $600,000 returned to exploited families, 82 violations formally documented. A public record that the city had looked at this company, found serious problems, and extracted consequences. That is not nothing. But here is the structural problem this case makes visible, and it is a problem that runs through the entire funeral industry. A fine is a cost of doing business. Settlements without admissions of wrongdoing do not require a company to say it did anything wrong. They require a company to write a check and agree to do better. And if they don't, if new violations occur, if new families are harmed, the process starts over. New complaint, new investigation, new lawsuit, new settlement. And in between each of those stages, there is time. There are more families walking through the door. RG Ortiz operates 8 locations. This is not a small operation. It is not a single bad actor running a one-room storefront. It is a funeral home network that embedded itself in communities where families had reason to trust it, particularly Spanish-speaking communities across New York City. Families were coming to Ortiz at one of the most vulnerable moments of their lives, relying on the people behind the desk to explain prices, paperwork, and what would happen to their loved one. From the very first phone call, the funeral home knew far more about that process than the family sitting across from them. Grieving the passing of a loved one can be the most challenging moment in our lives, DCWP Commissioner Vilda Vera Mayuga said at the time of the settlement, and no one should be exploited by predatory business practices during such a vulnerable time. Correct. And yet, the funeral home's explanation for the mix-up was that they received 2 people with the same name and confused the bodies. That is the explanation. Whatever the truth is, it describes a facility without adequate body identification controls, a place where the system for tracking whose body is whose could not prevent a catastrophic and irreversible error. That is not a one-time lapse in an otherwise functioning operation. That is a process failure. And process failures do not happen in isolation. They happen in environments where speed is prioritized over accuracy, where corners get cut, where volume is the metric and care is not. You can look at 74 complaints and see individual grievances. Or you can look at 74 complaints and see an environment. Here is the forensic takeaway. This family did everything right. They did not accept the stranger in the casket. They did not defer to the funeral home's hours of insistence. They did not take the ashes when the ashes were offered. At every point where the institution pushed, they pushed back. And that matters, because most families in that moment do not know they can. When you are standing in a funeral home, in grief, and the person behind the desk is telling you that you are wrong about your own father, the instinct is to doubt yourself. That is not weakness. That is what grief does. It destabilizes you. It makes the world feel slightly unreal. And a business that spent hours trying to leverage that instability against a family that was clearly, visibly right is not a business that deserves the benefit of the doubt on anything. So here is what Danielito's family understood that most people don't. You have rights at a viewing. You have the right to say the body in front of you is not your loved one. You have the right to refuse to proceed with a service until you have answers. You have the right to leave, contact an attorney, and not sign anything. No funeral home can force a family to accept remains or continue a service. If something feels wrong, it is not disrespectful to stop. It is the most respectful thing you can do. Before you are ever in that position, ask a funeral home one question most people never think to ask. How do you track and identify remains from the moment they arrive until the moment they leave? A licensed facility should be able to answer that without hesitation. They should describe a chain of custody, wristbands, documentation, a system. If they can't describe it, or if the answer is vague, that is information. Danielito's family did not get to say goodbye to their father. That cannot be undone. But what they did, standing in that room, refusing to be convinced, refusing the ashes, refusing to let it go quietly, that is the record. That is the lawsuit. That is why this story exists. They held firm so that the next family might not have to. This is Funeral Report. If this video gave you something to think about, share it with someone who might need it. And if you want to stay informed on how the death care industry actually operates, subscribe. This channel exists so that what happened to this family does not happen to yours.